We are studying Rambam's sprawling and fundamental introduction to his magisterial commentary to Mishnah. And we're trying to study and gain an insight, a brief overview into the various different books of the Mishnah. And we learned that there are 6 orders of Mishnah, Sheish Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And hitherto, we've covered 5 of them. The first one is Zeraim, agricultural laws, Moed, festivals, Nashim, women, Nizikin, damages, Kachim, sacrifices. And now we're up to the 6th and final order, Taharos, the laws of purity and impurity. Now, if we think of all the laws that we know of in the Torah and all the laws that we're able to fulfill in the Torah, the laws that relate to purity and impurity are relatively few. But if you actually compare the 6 orders of Mishnah, the longest one, the largest of the 6th, is the last one, is Taharos. And it's almost entirely not applicable today. We know that many of the laws of the Torah are only applicable when our nation is in its ideal state. We have the Holy Land, and we have the temple, and we have all the laws that stem from that status. The laws of purity and impurity are almost entirely non-applicable in a non-temple era. Now, we're talking about the laws of Tahara and Tumah, which we're translating as purity and impurity only because that's the closest English language word for Tumah and Tahara. But it's important to stress that there's absolutely no concept outside of Torah that's an equivalent to this Torah concept. So we're using the term, but we have to have that knowledge that it's not an accurate term. We're calling it purity and impurity. It's not exactly that. Now, what we're going to read about, we're going to learn about all these laws and the different categories of laws, and we'll find that we don't exactly understand it. We're going to have a very hard time to find any rationale for these concepts. And the Rambam tells us that all of these laws are what's known as chukim. In Torah, there are different categories of mitzvos. There are some mitzvos that make sense to everyone. In basically every society, every culture, amongst every people, there are laws not to murder, not to steal, and so on. Contracts and damages and interpersonal rights and things like that. If you have human intellect, you can deduce these mitzvos on your own. And there's a second category, mitzvos that even though you won't conceive them on your own, once you understand them, once they're explained to you, then it makes an abundance of sense. So, as an example, none of us, if we had to make a list of mitzvos on our own, would conceive of the tefillin. But once you learn about it and you understand it, and the heart and the mind and these important themes, these values that we want to remember, it will make sense after it's explained to us. And then there are mitzvos that remain impenetrable. They don't make any sense to us. We don't know, maybe we can't find out. Why is a cow kosher and a pig not kosher? What's the difference? Why is this one good for you spiritually and this one is bad for you spiritually? We don't know why, if you are impure, we'll get this in a bit, you're impure because you came into contact with the dead, you need to have a special potion. The potion of the red heifer. The ashes of the red heifer mixed with all sorts of other things, sprinkled upon you on day 3 and day 7. Makes zero sense to us, and no matter how hard we try, we won't understand it. There's only one person in history that understood it. That's Moshe. These laws, this third category, these chukim, they don't register with human intellect. And the laws of purity and impurity, basically all the laws of this order, will fall under this category. What is purity and impurity in this context? So impurity, ritual impurity we can call it, can be applied to 4 different entities. Number 1, people. Number 2, vessels, utensils. Number 3, foods. And number 4, drinks or liquids. Under certain circumstances, these entities can contract tuma, impurity. We call it ritual impurity. And there's lots and lots of ramifications of this impurity. And there are so many details, endless, myriads of details regarding purity and impurity. And we're just trying to get a bit of a flavor, a basic overview, so we're not ignorant in this subject. We have a degree of literacy in this order of Mishnah. So just to get started, there are different sources of impurity. What can spawn impurity? There are different degrees of impurity. Not all impurities are equal. There are different means of conveying, of transmitting the impurity. And every degree of impurity, every type of impurity, has all sorts of different laws that relate to it. And what about remedying the impurity? How do you undo it? How do you restore purity? There is so much over here. So let's start with the beginning. The highest level of impurity is a human corpse. This is the most impure thing that there is. It has the highest degree of impurity. In the literature, it's called the father of impurity. It's like we call it the granddaddy of impurity. Now, the commentaries do tell us that maybe there is an overarching theme that we can understand about impurity. Impurity is like the void that's left behind when life is taken away. So you have a human body that used to harbor a soul. And think about going from having a soul to losing a soul. That void is filled with other things called impurity, things that we cannot measure or perceive in any way because it's all spiritual. But it makes sense that if there was something, or there is something that harbors a soul and that's pulled away, then something very, very impure, very anti-soul, as it were, will fill the vacuum. And this is the highest degree of impurity. The father of impurity, the granddaddy of impurity. And there's something else that is a source of impurity, something called a sheretz. A sheretz means like an animal, a disgusting animal, a vermin, a creepy crawler. And there's a list. You read the Torah in Scripture in Vayikra Leviticus chapter 11, verses 29 and 30. It lists 8 different animals that are impure. Now, these animals, if you have them as a pet and they're still alive, there's no impurity. These animals, when they die, their carcass is a source of impurity. Now, the Torah lists these animals by name, these 8 shratzim, these 8 creepy crawlers, these 8 rodents by name, but there are some disputes exactly what those names refer to. But the different types of lizards or moles or toads or mice or weasels or hedgehogs, it's not exactly clear if we can identify with unanimity what exactly those 8 shratzim are. And of course, we have no idea why certain animals are included and certain animals are excluded. But it's interesting, I did see one of the commentators asks maybe an obvious question. When we think of animals and impurity, there's one animal that jumps to the top of the list. There's one animal that is like the symbol of impurity. And that's the snake. That's the force of impurity. That's the evil inclination. That's what got Adam and Eve to sin. But somehow it's not listed in this list of 8 shratzim, of 8 animals that are impure. The dead carcass of a snake does not convey this impurity. So I read an argument, very interesting. We know that snakes to be very dangerous. And if they're dangerous, it's a mitzvah to kill it, and thus to eliminate that danger. And people, in the times of the temple certainly, were very hypersensitive to their state of purity and or impurity. And they knew you can't walk into the temple, you can't eat certain foods, you can't participate in the Passover pastoral offering if you're impure. So what's going to be, you're walking into the temple and you see a snake, and you're like, I ain't touching that, I'm not smashing the snake, because then there'll be a dead snake and maybe it'll be cause of an impurity. And that's a risk because we have to smash that snake. And therefore, maybe, just maybe, that's the reason why the Torah did not include the snake in this list of 8 animals. When they are dead, they are a source of impurity. Then there's the nevela. This refers to the carcass of an animal, any animal in this case, with the exception of the carcass of a kosher animal slaughtered in the proper kosher manner. So there's a cow. Cow's a kosher animal. You slaughter it in a kosher fashion. You have meat. You're holding meat. That is not a nevela. That's not impure. Or a goat, or a chicken, or a deer. A kosher animal slaughtered in a kosher fashion is not a nevela. There's no impurity in that dead carcass. Similarly, fish in no situation can transmit impurity. Insects cannot transmit impurity. Non-kosher birds cannot transmit impurity. But a kosher bird who died without being properly slaughtered can, in fact, transmit impurity. But as we will learn, there are so many different ways to convey impurity. And the only way that a kosher bird that died without being properly slaughtered can convey impurity is if it is swallowed, meaning if someone violates the law and eats the non-kosher bird, not because the bird, the species is not kosher, but because it was processed, it was slaughtered in a non-kosher fashion, and they violate that, then they are actually contracting the impurity of a kosher bird that died without being properly slaughtered. A mitzora, someone who has tsaras. Tsaras is a disease that resembles but is not identical to leprosy. Of course, we have 2 portions in the Torah, Tazria and Mitzora. They talk about a person who has this blotch on their skin, or that discoloration on their hair, or that sign, or that event that renders them impure. That could be another source of impurity. And there's all sorts of emissions from people that create a source of impurity. So a nida, that's a woman who menstruates. A yoledes, that's a woman who gave birth. And by the way, they explain, based upon that concept that we mentioned earlier, if there was life within a person and they lost that life, for one reason or the other, there's a certain vacuum, a certain void that is filled with impurity. A zava, which is a woman who has irregular emissions. Or a zav, which is a man who experiences emissions of a substance that resembles but is not identical to a seminal emission. And then there's shechvazer, which is the seminal emission itself. So all these different types of things are sources of impurity. Now, it gets more and more complicated. So if it's complicated till now, just fasten your seatbelts. There are many different types and levels and degrees of impurity. Now, when something is impure, it has certain laws, but it may also transmit that impurity if it has a touch point, a contact, an interaction with something which is pure. So if something is impure and it meets and it has an interface with something which is pure, the impurity can be transmitted. And the degree of impurity of the original source of impurity will determine the degree of impurity of the recipient of that transmission of impurity. Something which is more impure, which is a higher degree of impurity, It has more power to transmit impurity, and the impurity that it transmits is also on a relatively high level. To simplify, there are 6 different degrees of impurity. We already learned about the highest level of impurity, not the father of impurity, but the father of the father, the granddaddy of impurity. That's the highest level of impurity. And then there's the next level, which is the father, not the grandfather, the father of impurity. And then there's the first of impurity, and then the second, and then the third, and then the fourth. All told, 6 different degrees of impurity. There are 4 potential entities that can become impure. We spoke about people, vessels, food items, and liquids. If there is a point of contact between a dead body and any one of these 4, the granddaddy of impurity can transmit impurity to all 4. Now, it gets, of course, very complicated, very technical. So if there's a dead body, the granddaddy of impurity, it makes a person or a vessel impure. How impure is that person or vessel? They have the next level. So if it's level 1, and then there's level 2 now. The dead body, the highest level, level 1, granddaddy of impurity. A person touches it. The person is now impure. He's the first of impurity. A vessel touches the dead body. That vessel is the first, again, which is level 2. It's confusing. It's the father, meaning granddaddy, daddy. The corpse is the granddaddy, and the thing that touches it, the person or the vessel, becomes the daddy, the next level. So it's the second level. I said the first, I meant it's the second level, and it's known as the father of impurity. But if the dead body touches food or beverage or drinks or liquids, they become impure, but it doesn't go from granddaddy to daddy. It actually skips a level. It goes from granddaddy to first, which, if you're keeping track, I don't know if I lost everyone already, or that's going to happen soon. It goes from level 1 to level 3. So we have the highest level, level 1, granddaddy, and the next level is daddy, father of impurity, av hatuma. We spoke about the Metzora, someone who has saras. They are avatuma. The zav, that man with the multiple emissions, avatuma, father of impurity. The zava, the nida, the yoledes, the nevela, the 8 shratzim. These are all categories of impurity that have the degree of impurity, which are second of 6, known as the avatuma, the father of impurity. And when they render impurity onward, that goes down 1 level. So granddaddy, daddy, and then the third level, which is known as the first, rishon latuma. And all 4 things that can become impure, namely people, vessels, known as adam v'kelim, or food and drink, liquids, ochlin umashtin, they become impure if they have a contact with the father of impurity, which is 2 of 6. They become 3 of 6, known as rishon, the first of impurity. So just for the sake of argument to understand this, suppose there's a person who has contact with a dead body. And we'll see how that contact has to happen. There's different ways it can have contact, which of course the whole subject is confusing. A person becomes impure with the degree of severity, the second of 6. They are the avatuma, the father of impurity. And they're impure for 7 days. And they can only become pure if they have the special potion, the special elixir, the ashes of the red heifer mixed with other things sprinkled upon them. By contrast, if there's a person who is impure, not because they're the granddaddy of impurity, but because they became impure by contact with the father of impurity, so they're the next level, level 3, known as the first of impurity, they're only impure for 1 day. And they don't have to have that whole same process to become pure. Level 1, granddaddy. Level 2, father. Level 3 is the first of impurity. On this level of impurity, they can only transmit impurity not to people, not to utensils, but only to food and to liquids. So if one person touches the dead body, they become a source of impurity themselves. They touch someone else, so the dead body is the highest level, granddaddy of impurity. The person who touched the dead body is the second highest level. And the person that they touch, that they convey the impurity, becomes the third highest level, the father of impurity. But that does not pass on further to the fourth person, as it were. On this level of impurity, level 3, we called it the Rishon L'Toma, the first of impurity, they can only transmit impurity to food and beverages, not to people, not to utensils. And again, the food and or liquids that they render impure are going to drop down to the next level. Granddaddy, highest level. Father, first, now second. And level 4, that's the second of impurity. This is already very weak. Highest level, second highest level, third highest level. This is the fourth highest level. And they can't really transmit impurity that much further. They can only transmit impurity to sacrificial things, sacrifices, sacrificial foods. These are things that are so spiritually sensitive that if they come into contact with a second of impurity, which is again level 4, they become impure and they become the third of impurity, which is level 5. And level 5, the third of impurity, they can barely transmit the impurity onward. Nothing besides for sacrifices themselves can become impure due to contact with the third of impurity, which we're calling level 5. And a sacrifice that became impure due to contact with level 5 impurity becomes themselves level 6 of impurity, which we called the fourth of impurity. So that's confusing because it's level 6 because there's the daddy and the granddaddy. It's known as the fourth of impurity, but in our list, it's the 6th. And once something has that status, there's no capacity for it to transmit the impurity any further. Now, again, everything is just the absolute basic simplification. You can spend a whole lifetime studying this order of Mishnah and do it well, but not really know it well enough. You could do 70, 80 years. For sure, not a question. There's so much there. Let's go a little bit further into the weeds. There are 4 different categories of things that can become impure. Adam v'kelim, people and vessels. Ochlem umashtin, food and liquids. There's all sorts of laws as to what exactly are the criteria for these entities to qualify. So we spoke about vessels. What's a vessel? The law states there are 7 different materials that can become impure. Number 1, earthenware. Number 2, wood. Number 3, metal. Number 4, leather, bone, cloth, and sack. Only items made of these 7 materials can become impure. If there's a vessel made of stone, it cannot become impure by Torah law. Glass is a whole discussion that's maybe impure for other purposes by rabbinic severity. Moreover, for a vessel to become impure, it has to be usable. So someone has material, it's wood, it's leather, it's metal, but it hasn't been fashioned, crafted into a usable item, it cannot become impure. It's not quite a keli, vessel. Foods. A food must be edible by humans. It cannot be attached to the ground or to a tree. So if you have a fruit, it's food, it can become impure. Or wheat, it can become impure, it's food, but they have to be picked. They have to be harvested. Moreover, it has to be primed. If you cut the fruit off the tree, it must be primed. must be rendered in order to become impure. And that's done by making it wet. Making it wet with 7 very specific liquids. These 7 alone. So if the food was never washed, as it were, it hasn't been primed, it hasn't been rendered, it's not huchshar, it cannot become impure. Again, lots and lots and lots of details. Okay, how is impurity conveyed? How is it transmitted? How is it transferred? There's all sorts of different ways that impurity in one entity can be passed on to the other entity. So, example we gave, someone touches the dead body. They need to prepare the dead body for burial. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. If something impure has direct contact with something which is pure, it can convey the impurity. Another way that impurity can be conveyed is by carrying. If you are carrying something which is impure, even if you don't touch it directly, it can transmit impurity to you. Mishkav and moshav, sitting and lying. If there's something which is impure, like a person who's impure, and they are sitting and lying upon something, then they can transmit impurity to all the things that they are sitting and lying upon. And then finally, there's the tumas ohel, which means the impurity of a tent. This is a type of transmission of impurity that's only true, it's exclusive to the highest level of impurity, to the granddaddy of impurity, to the human corpse. A human corpse transmits impurity not only by being touched or carried, but even if it is in the same enclosure. So, if there's a dead body in a room, every person in that room is now impure. Tumas meis, the impurity of encountering a dead body, even if they didn't touch it, they're just in the same enclosure, the same tent. Now, the tent is not just a room, it could be anything under the same roof. The impurity permeates the entire enclosure. Anything that's within that enclosure becomes impure. Which is why, for example, we have very, very large enclosures, like a hospital. A hospital could be a city block long, but it has one roof, right? It's one enclosure. Any dead body in any one of those rooms, that impurity permeates the entire structure, and any person who is in that facility has now the designation of being impure. Okay, when there is impurity, can it be remedied? And exactly how is that done? Some things cannot become pure once they are impure, but some things can. So, of course, this depends on what we're talking about and what degree of impurity is there here. And the details, of course, are vast and voluminous. But again, general overview is that something which is impure, like a person who's impure, they need to go to the mikveh. And they may need to wait until nightfall. And as we mentioned earlier, if someone came into contact with the dead, even if it's via the same enclosure, they need a very long process, a 7-day process. And on day 3 and day 7 of this process, they are sprinkled with that special potion of the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer. And of course, certain impurities cannot be remedied. If something is impure, be it an object, a food, a person, they cannot go into the temple or even on the grounds of the temple. They cannot touch, a person who is impure cannot touch sacrificial foods. Today, it's one of the big controversial questions. Are Jews allowed to go onto Temple Mount? If you walk into in Jerusalem and you walk towards the Temple Mount, there's big signs. According to Jewish law, it is forbidden for Jews to walk upon Temple Mount. And that's accurate. But there's some very important specifics that need to be addressed. Only the exact borders of the actual temple grounds, someone who is impure with the impurity of coming into contact with the dead is forbidden to enter. But the general complex, so long as someone doesn't have other degrees of impurity, some argue, they're allowed to go. And do we know exactly where the temple grounds were? Today, we assume that every person has the status of being impure due to contact with the dead. If you were in hospital, it's quite likely you were in the same enclosure as a dead body. So you may have become impure. And the only way to remedy that is with the red heifer. And I don't imagine that many of us were sprinkled with the special red heifer potion. So if we're all impure with the second highest degree of impurity, the avatum, or the father of impurity, we cannot walk onto the actual temple grounds. But where exactly is that? It's a big question. Very controversial. And of course, there's all sorts of other variables that we haven't even discussed. That's a general overview of the various different subjects. Let's talk about the books in this order. The first book of the 12 books of this order of Mishnah is Kalim, which means vessels. And as we mentioned, vessels can become impure. But for it to become impure, as we mentioned, it has to be useful, it has to be designed, it has to be fashioned into some sort of useful implement. So different types of vessels, different categories of vessels, different materials in vessels, the statuses of the handles of the vessels, and so on. This is known as one of the most complicated books in all of Mishnah. Any set of Mishnah you'll see, the thickest one will invariably be this one. It's very long, and it's very complicated. And it's extra complicated due to many of the vessels discussed in the book being obsolete, being anachronistic. They're describing vessels that you've never seen before. Primitive vessels. There's actually people who have dedicated their lives towards identifying every single vessel that's mentioned in this book and understanding its form and function, and even creating illustrations for each one of these vessels. So that way, people who want to study these laws, these very intricate and complex laws, can have a sense of the different vessels being discussed. The second book is called Ahalos. Ahalos means tents. As we mentioned, there is one type of impurity, the highest level of impurity, the dead body. It can transmit impurity in a way that no other source of impurity can. Anything that's in an enclosure, a tent, well, the different types of tents, will become impure. So all the details of that. When the Talmud wants to discuss an example of a very difficult and complicated law, it mentions this book as one of the two books. The next book is actually the next. The other book that it mentions is the very next book in this order. I will tell you maybe the most famous Mishnah in this book, which is the second of this order. Chapter 7, Mishnah 6. It's a bit gory, but it's the only source in the Mishnah that talks about abortion. And in fact, any halachic analysis of that subject will always begin with this Mishnah. It talks about a woman who's having trouble giving birth, and there's a determination that the life of the mother is being threatened by the baby. And it describes, again, very gory, that what they have to do is they have to kill the baby. They have to, because the baby's threatening the mom. And when we look at the baby versus the mom has superiority. Her life precedes the life of the baby. So long as the baby's inside, says the Mishnah, then there's a hierarchy. And it describes that they have to kill the baby. Very, very, it's a little bit hard to read because it's a little bit gory. Her life takes precedence over the life of the baby. However, once the baby begins to emerge, the baby's head is out, then they are considered equal. And then, if there's still a troubled labor delivery, then we cannot touch the baby. Why? Because the baby's life is now, because they're now out in the world, they are considered to be on the same level, the same value, if you will, as the mom, and we cannot kill one to save the other. We don't cast aside one soul to save another soul. Very interesting. And again, the starting point of any serious halachic discussion about abortion. That's ahalos. Let's move on to the third book, Negaim. The word Negaim is the word for someone or something stricken with tzara'as. That's the leprosy-like malady that afflicts a person's body or maybe their clothing or their house. Those are all called a nega, which means an affliction. Negaim is afflictions. All the laws of afflictions, the size of the affliction, the color, the location. Someone who is suspected to have tzaras, someone who is confirmed to have tzaras. And of course, the means by which tzaras is ameliorated. This is the other book that is the portrait of a complex and intricate law. There are several teachings of the Talmud where Rabbi Akiva, he quotes a teaching about a given matter, and it's considered to be a more of an easier matter to wrap your head around. And Rabbi Akiva is chided by his colleagues. Rabbi Akiva, why are you dealing with the easy things? You have the mind and the capacity to deal with the most complex laws. Go study the laws of Ahalos and Negaim, which is again the second and third books of this order. Book number 4 is Para, that relates to the laws of Paraduma, the red heifer. And then comes Taharos. This is also the name of the order and the name of the book. It deals with the impurities of foods and liquids. Mikvaos, the laws of a mikvah. That's the ritual bath, which is the central component or essential component of any process of purification. Nida, that's the laws of a woman who is menstruating. Although almost all the laws of this order are not pertinent today, this particular book is very pertinent because in addition that a woman's impure when she menstruates, it's forbidden to cohabit with a menstruating woman until she goes to the mikvah. So this is still very much relevant and pertinent today. Machshirin, the next book. Recall, we mentioned briefly, for a food to become impure, it has to be rendered for impurity. It has to be primed. It has to be prepared for it. It has to be made wet by one of the 7 liquids. The book of Machshirin is the book on the priming of foods to become capable, susceptible to impurity. Zavim, the next book. You recall, a man can become impure if he or they have multiple emissions, multiple discharges. This is not a seminal emission, that's something else. It's similar, it's not exactly the same. The Mishnah actually lists 3 differences between a seminal emission and a zav emission. The next book, Tivul Yom. As we mentioned earlier, very briefly, some people, even after they go to the mikvah, they still are not impure. They have to wait till nightfall. So Tivul Yom means someone who went to the mikvah today. Someone who immersed in the mikvah today, but they need to wait until nightfall. So what's the status of a person between the immersion during the day and the nightfall? They're known as a Tivul Yom, and all the laws of that status are found in this book. The next book, Yadayim, which means literally hands. That's the impurity of hands. And this is primarily about the rabbinic decree of impurity assigned to a person's hands. The hands, they're always touching things. They're askanios. They're always moving around. And people are not always 100% aware of what they're touching. And their hands could be dirty. They won't even necessarily be aware of it. Their hands could be a little sweaty, and they won't even be aware of it. And what's going to be if they touch sacrificial foods with their dirty hands? Not impure hands per se, dirty hands. And now they made the sacrificial food dirty and not as exciting. It's disgusting. Ooh, you touched it. Ooh, I don't want to eat that. In order to prevent the mistreatment of sacrificial foods that are not touched with dirty hands, the rabbis made a decree that hands that are unwashed are impure. And if you cannot touch sacrificial foods until you wash your hands. And in this book, we learn about all the other laws related to washing your hands before eating bread, wash your hands in the morning, wash your hands after going to the bathroom, wash your hands before and after you eat. All that relates to the tumas yadayim, the impurity of hands. And the final book of this order, and the final book of all of Mishnah, is utsin, which means stems. For a food to become impure, it has to be edible, we mentioned. What about something which is close to being edible, but not quite edible? Like the stems of fruits, of vegetables, the hard peel of a fruit, the shell of a nut, the bone of a piece of meat. Is that food or is that not food? It's sort of food, but it's not quite edible. So there's a big difference if it's still attached to the edible part of the food or not. Once they're detached, they are not subject to becoming impure because they're not edible food. But when they're still attached, they're still united with the edible part of the food, then they may become impure under certain circumstances. I want to read the final teaching, the final Mishnah in all of Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Joshua, son of Levi, said, Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the future, the Holy One, blessed is He, will bestow upon each and every tzaddik, each and every righteous person, Shalosh Meos Va'asara Olamos, 310 worlds. What's the reward that will be in the future for every righteous person? 310 worlds. Quotes a verse in Proverbs, Lehanchil ohavayesh va'otrosem amalei, I will bequeath to those who love me, yesh. Yesh means existence. But yesh is also the gematria, 310. The yud is 10, and the shin is 300. And the very last words of all of Mishnah, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta says, the Almighty did not find a vessel that can hold blessing for Israel like peace. Peace is the vessel that can absorb blessing, that can harbor blessing. Quotes a verse in Psalms, Hashem oz la'amo yitenet, God will give strength to his nation, Israel. Hashem yivarech es amo b'shalom, God will bless his nation with peace. Peace is the vessel of blessing. Now, why are there 310 worlds that are the destiny of each and every tzaddik? There is an enormous amount of literature about this question. The Or Chaim points out that the greatest scholar of the tribes is always Issachar, Yisachar. And if you spell the word Yisachar, if you just say the word, it's Yisachar. But if you see how it's spelled, it's Yis-Sachar, which can be spelled as Yesh-Sachar, which means there is the same word. 310, Sachar means reward. You study Torah, you get the reward. What reward? Which reward? The reward of 310. I remember hearing some alternative interpretations. How many mitzvahs are there? So of course we all know there are 613 mitzvahs. And that's true. But it's not completely true, because that's only the mitzvos that are in the Torah. There are 7 rabbinic mitzvos. So if you add up the total of all the mitzvos, it's 620. And of course, every mitzvah is a world. So the maximum amount of worlds that a person has is 620. But everyone has some sort of partner. If you're married, you have a spouse. You got to split the worlds with your spouse. And if you're someone who's studying, well, there's someone who's helping contribute towards that. There's the Yisachar Zevulun agreement. Yisachar was the great scholar, he studied. Zevulun was the great businessman, he did business, and they split the proceeds together. Each one got 310. These are the laws of purity and impurity. And again, the vast majority of these laws are not applicable today. Please God, Messiah comes, temples rebuilt, And instantly, the amount of Torah that we can fulfill will quintuple, or even more than that, will grow immeasurably, and all these laws will once again be in effect. We'll have to all become very hyper-aware of our state of spiritual purity, ritual purity and impurity. In antiquity, they had ritual baths everywhere. Even today, they do. And you dig anywhere in Jerusalem or in Judea, you always find mikvahs, always find ritual baths. Why? Because people were always very, very aware of their spiritual status. If they were impure, every process of purification would require immersion in the mikvah. There were mikvahs everywhere. But we're going to continue now that we got this brief overview of the 6 Orders of Mishnah. We're going to continue the Rambam's quite a lengthy and very fundamental introduction to his commentary on Mishnah. I'm looking forward to doing that with y'all sometime soon. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.